welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we get started, a quick note to our listeners that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the show or even leaving a positive review. It really does help sustain our work. And if you'd like to explore all the other topics we've covered in the past, you can find a full archive of the show at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. When the late Zimbabwean dictator Robert Mugabe was ousted in 2017, celebrations broke out across the country as people cheered the end of his 37-year grip on power. One of the people celebrating was Evan Mawarire, a pastor and pro-democracy activist who had been imprisoned and even tortured for demanding political reforms and an end to the corruption and misrule that had plagued Zimbabwe under Mugabe. But as we now know, things didn't change. Under Mugabe's successor, President Emmerson Mnangagwa, and the continued rule of his ZANU-PF party, the country remains mired in a persistent economic crisis, while dissidents and journalists are subjected to the threat of harassment, arbitrary detention, and torture. The situation has only gotten worse since last year, with the World Bank reporting that half of Zimbabweans fell into extreme poverty during the COVID-19 pandemic. Joining me today on Trendlines to discuss the latest developments in Zimbabwe is none other than Pastor Evan Mawarire himself, a 2020 Yale World Fellow. He continues to speak out against the ongoing climate of repression and corruption in Zimbabwe. Evan, welcome to Trendlines. It's really nice to have you here.
Elliot, thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to sit with you and talk about my home country, Zimbabwe.
For the sake of our listeners who aren't familiar with your story, could you just take us back to the video that you recorded in April 2016, the circumstances that led to it, and what exactly you said in that video?
In April of 2016, I sat in my small church office in Harare, Zimbabwe. My wife and I had been pastoring a small church of about 90 people for maybe about 8-9 years, it must have been. And I sat in that small office realizing that I'd come to a place where I personally was finding it difficult to provide for my family. My 2 young daughters were just at the beginning of school, and my earnings as a pastor and as an entrepreneur, because I had to subsidize my salary, were just not cutting it to send my children to school. In fact, at that point, I was beginning to struggle to put food on the table for my family, and it bothered me. I had turned 40 that year, and I felt like Zimbabwe as a country had robbed me of the opportunities to become the kind of person I felt that I could have become. And so I thought to myself, I need to vent. More than anything else, I was angry, and I just wanted to vent. I was not trying to be an activist. I was not trying to start any kind of movement or political movement as what later unfolded. I just wanted to express how angry I was and frustrated I was with Zimbabwe and where Zimbabwe had brought me as an individual. So I propped up my phone against my Bible on my desk and tried my best. When you watch the video, you can see that I'm trying to fit into the frame because I've propped it up on the desk. So I'm crouching down onto the desk to try and fit my face into the frame. And I start to talk about Zimbabwe and the Zimbabwean flag, because in my office, I had a Zimbabwean flag that was there. And it wasn't rehearsed. And I just began to talk about this flag and what it represents and what it stands for. And it was very much impromptu. It was very much just, hey, this is what I sense about Zimbabwe. And I began to talk about the colors of the flag and what they mean and what they taught us when we were in primary school that those colors mean. The yellow stands for the wealth of the minerals that are in Zimbabwe in the ground. The green stands for Zimbabwe's agricultural economy, economy that's vibrant. The red stands for the blood that was shed during the liberation struggle. The black stands for the black majority who are Zimbabweans and can now vote and can now be a part of decision making going forward. All of these things. The white stands for peace, and I began to challenge what each of those things stood for when Zimbabwe got independence, and unfortunately what it looks like now, and that all of those had been violated. And in the video, I make a call to Zimbabweans where I say, listen, if you care about this country, then quit standing on the sidelines and pretending as if you don't see where this country's at. And every time this flag flies, it's calling out to you for help. It's calling out for you to say something, to speak up and to stand up. I don't think I fully understood what I was saying. And so I posted that video on Facebook and it blew up. I mean, it just went completely viral. And because I kept mentioning the phrase, this flag, people began to call it hashtag this flag. And before I knew it, within maybe about a month or so, I had a huge following on Facebook. There was discussions around, citizen voices and ordinary people speaking up. And I decided to make a few more videos to try and explain that what I was not saying, because at this point there seemed to be an interest from the government. There were accusations about me being, a foreign funded, agitator trying to destabilize the government and so forth. So I was now trying to explain that, no, that's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is just speak up about where I'm at as a citizen. Those videos actually, in trying to explain, became even more material that people found genuine, found like it represented what they wanted to say and what they felt about Zimbabwe, and added to the fuel. And so this began to continue to grow until we came to a place where myself and a couple of friends decided that we would formally set up a citizens movement that would speak truth to power. And of course, the journey then unfolded from there. 4 years later, we had put together some of the largest protests in Zimbabwe, where we were able to bring the entire country to a standstill with a non-violent protest where we asked people to stay at home. We asked people to carry their flags with them as a way of saying, no to corruption, injustice, and poverty. And the government response was brutal. I was arrested in July of 2016 for the first time, July 12th, I think it was, and thrown into Chikurubi maximum security prison. What follows in Zimbabwean prisons when you're arrested includes a lot of torture and a lot of injustice. But something peculiar happened during that time. We began to see people rally around this movement in ways they had not done before. As one of really the first citizens movement to come up, I remember my first appearance in court when I was arrested, out of character, completely out of character for Zimbabweans. Thousands of people gathered at the courts and just packed the courts inside, and there were thousands of people outside. They were carrying flags. They were singing, they were kneeling and praying into the night with candles. And it was just a profound moment of hope. And I think finding something new within us that we never knew we had, to stand up to the brutality and the dictatorship of Robert Mugabe.
It must have been quite surreal for you stumbling upon this status, given that all you wanted to do at first was record this video and vent your anger at the system. And then it led to this tremendous reaction.
Oh, absolutely. It felt like I was living in a dream, because this is not something that I or most Zimbabweans would ordinarily do, especially under Robert Mugabe. If you know anything about Robert Mugabe, you would know that he was a dictator who did not take any form of opposition or disobedience or any form of pushback lightly. Over the years, right off the bat in 1982 to about 1980, maybe 85, you will know about the Gukurahundi genocide that Robert Mugabe had perpetrated, had over 20,000 people in the south of the country killed because he thought that they were forming an uprising against him. And then through the years after that, anyone who stood up against Robert Mugabe, whether internally in his party or externally, was treated brutally. Most were murdered, most disappeared, and many were treated, brutally in jail, charged with treason, and all sorts of things. I was charged with treason eventually when I was arrested as well, and more than once when it happened. So this was not something that I had planned for or something that I had ever pictured myself doing. It really was shocking me as much as it was shocking everyone else who was watching or who could see what we were doing.
And that protest movement helped contribute to the resignation or the forced resignation of Robert Mugabe in 2017, after which his vice president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, came to power and promised a new beginning for the country, a so-called new dispensation based on political and economic reforms. How much cause for optimism was there at that time?
It's difficult to explain the sheer amount of hope that we had in that moment when Robert Mugabe finally resigned, when he left. The circumstances of his departure, of course, were that the military and some of his lieutenants had turned against him. And we joined in, like you've just said, that we contributed as a movement towards his departure by mobilizing people to then get onto the streets and call for his departure. And the reason we joined in was that Zimbabweans had come to a place after 37 years, almost 40 years of Robert Mugabe in power, where we realized that this is our moment to see a different Zimbabwe. We may not see it for long for those of us who are well on in age, but we have a generation coming and they get a chance to see a Zimbabwe that works, that's different, that is just. So there was a lot of hope. 2008 had been a very difficult year for Zimbabwe. The economic collapse, the record-breaking economic collapse of Zimbabwe had decimated people's lives. If anyone remembers, we had gotten to a place where our inflation was so high that we had a $100 trillion note as part of our regime of notes. And that was not even enough to buy a loaf of bread or get a haircut. And here we were again in 2016, beginning another cycle of economic collapse because of the corruption. So the joy and the ecstasy and the euphoria of seeing the back of Robert Mugabe was through the roof. Everybody expected that no matter what happens from here, we are at such a low point that the only way we can go is up. Even if we rose up just slightly, even if our economy did well just a little bit, even if the lives of people improved just marginally, it would be better than where we were coming from. So the expectation for hope and a better Zimbabwe was through the roof. Everyone was ready to participate in making sure that Zimbabwe would be a better country.
You're on the record a couple of years later, I believe in 2019, saying that in fact, after Mugabe's departure, things got worse under Mnangagwa. Is that still the case? Is that still an assertion that you stand by?
Absolutely, Elliot. I stand by that assertion because it is the truth. Robert Mugabe was a bad leader and was an authoritarian leader. But when Emmerson Mnangagwa took power, I think what makes it absolutely shocking is the number of times that he has deployed the military on the streets, and they have actually killed people. Okay. Under Robert Mugabe, this is something that never happened in terms of openly deploying the military onto the streets and shooting people in protest openly. Robert Mugabe had killed people using the army in Matabeleland, through the genocide. But here is Mnangagwa taking it a step further, where he is actually deploying the military to shoot live ammunition against his own people. This happened in August of 2018, soon after the election, which was a disputed election because citizens felt that it was rigged. And when they took to the streets to protest, people were shot. This happened again in January of 2019 when we organized a shutdown protest or stay-at-home protest because of the rising cost of living and because of the corruption. And again, people were shot at by the military. Women were raped in their homes. I was in prison during that time again in 2019, January. I was arrested and was with men who were beaten to a pulp that I slept next to in the cells on the floor. Their limbs, their legs were broken. Their ribs were cracked. They told stories of them being dragged out of their beds with their 12 and 15-year-old boys, some of them who were with us in the cells, and taken to police stations and charged with crimes that they did not even know. And then them receiving news when they were in prison that the soldiers had come back home and taken their wives and sisters and raped them. So this was another level of mobilizing against the citizenry. And so here we find ourselves now where the corruption has gotten worse. Over the last couple of months, officials from Mnangagwa's government have been caught at different airports around the world smuggling bags of gold out of the country. This is unprecedented. What's happening in Zimbabwe. So it's gotten worse in terms of democracy. It's gotten worse in terms of even the economy. It's gotten worse in terms of peace. It's gotten worse in terms of respect for law and having a country that is run, by its constitution and the rule of law.
How much of a factor does the coronavirus pandemic play into this? Because there's been a lot of talk around the world about dictators seizing on the pandemic to strengthen their hand vis-a-vis protesters and political opponents. How much of that pattern did we see play out in Zimbabwe as well?
I think we saw that play out in Zimbabwe immensely. The coronavirus was a gift to dictators and authoritarian regimes in that it became an excuse to block or to stop any activity that the Constitution allows in terms of the right to protest, the freedom to associate oneself with particular political opinions. It stifled the right to challenge government or to question government on certain actions. In Zimbabwe, the military was used for lockdowns again, and again, this is in violation of our constitution. And I remember there was a protest planned in Zimbabwe in July of 2020, and that protest was completely shut down by the deployment of the army, of the military onto the streets. And the government claimed that it was because they were trying to make sure that the spread of the coronavirus was contained. In actual fact, that was not the case. They were really scared that this would galvanize people to speak truth to power. So we've seen them then every night again, where there has been, say, for example, scheduled by-elections, where government knows that the ruling party is going to lose, or that their surrogate parties that they have co-opted are going to lose. They've gone in and said, we are postponing or cancelling by-elections up until a certain point because of the coronavirus. We've seen it happen with certain laws that government has passed in Zimbabwe without due process of consulting the public. For example, the president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, went ahead and instituted a law in Zimbabwe that allows him to appoint judges, which is not what is supposed to happen. Our constitution states that the judges are chosen through an interview process, and then the ones that are chosen are the ones who are recommended for the positions. But we saw the president rush a process through parliament, rush a process through that he then signed into law, and yet the public had not been consulted. And of course, the excuses raised were that because of coronavirus, proper consultations could not be done. Well, if proper consultations could not be done, then the law could not be passed. But we saw them go ahead and do it. So many things have been rushed through, have been done, processed through in ways they shouldn't have been processed. And the presence of the virus has been used as an excuse to do all of those things.
We've seen a crackdown in Zimbabwe, not only on dissidents and activists like yourself, but on journalists as well. Just to give one recent example, Jeffrey Moyo, a freelancer who worked for the New York Times and other outlets, was arrested last month and jailed for several weeks on suspicion of being a national security threat. How familiar does this tactic look to you? Is it something that we also saw the ZANU-PF use under Mugabe?
Yes, it is. This is a very familiar tactic where ZANU-PF focuses on a particular voice or focuses on, someone that they feel can be a threat, and they attempt to make an example of that one individual to the rest of the country or the rest of the citizens. Jeffrey Moyo's case is part of a larger crackdown on journalists in Zimbabwe, which this time has become a lot more heavy-handed than it was under Robert Mugabe. I mean, Robert Mugabe attacked, veteran journalists like Jeff Nyarota back in the day, who was part of an independent newspaper. That newspaper, in fact, at one point, their production facility was bombed. Their printing press was bombed. by suspected ZANU-PF activists. So what we see happening in Zimbabwe is Mnangagwa's government cranking it up, stepping it up. Before Jeffrey Moyo was arrested, there is a journalist, a freelance journalist, Hopewell Chingono, who has been arrested. Maybe now it might be 3 or 4 times. And Hopewell Chingono has been arrested because he exposed corruption. Corruption in the president's office, corruption in the president's lieutenants, people close to him, corruption in the president's family, his children, his wife. These are people that have been involved in corruption. And Hopewell exposed that and put articles together with evidence that he had, real evidence. And he was arrested, he was beaten, he was jailed for it, he was charged with all sorts of crimes, for that. So you can see that this particular regime is wanting to control the narrative, but is also wanting to instill fear, just like Robert Mugabe did. They want to instill fear to let people know that we will not hesitate to use persecution by prosecution on you. You know that in Zimbabwe, if you're arrested and your bail is denied, it's going to be 2-3 weeks. It's going to be a month whilst you're behind bars before you get a bail approval for you to come out. And then it will be another year whilst you're on trial, even though you might end up getting acquitted, like I did maybe on 3 or 4 occasions when I eventually got my acquittals.
It seems also that there's a common thread here of raising the insidious prospect of foreign influence at work. Claiming journalists are national security threats carries echoes to me of the things that the government said about you when you first put your video, that you were sponsored by some kind of foreign agent or being, funded by a foreign regime or something like that. How much of a role does that play in the current government propping itself up?
What the regime tries to do, Robert Mugabe did the same thing, Emmerson Mnangagwa does the same thing. What they try to do is they try to insinuate that Zimbabweans do not have enough agency to put together either the kind of articles that the journalists put together with that much detail. They don't have that kind of agency themselves unless they are assisted by foreign powers who are attempting to overthrow the government or who are attempting to make the government look bad. They are insinuating, when they have arrested people like myself who are citizen voices, they're insinuating that Zimbabweans don't have enough intelligence or they just don't have enough care to be able to put together the kind of protest that we did, and that there must be some sort of incentive that's being given to them by these foreign governments. And in particular, the Zimbabwean government and ZANU-PF have always blamed the West. They've always blamed European governments. They've always blamed the United States for influencing civic society, for influencing activists and giving them incentive to speak up against their government, which is really a shame, because I think it says a lot about how our government thinks, or what the government thinks about its own people, that they are not smart enough to know when they are being mistreated, or that they are not smart enough to know what's good for them, that they cannot demand for themselves the kind of country they want. They must always just be given whatever is prepared for them and take it without complaint. But I think also a more honest approach to it is that government knows that the people are starting to wake up. They know that the people are becoming bolder and braver, and that at some point they will have enough in them to stand up. And so, as an excuse, they cannot really accuse people of saying, well, you're rising up against us because you've had enough. They have to find a reason. And so the fallback has always been, you're rising up against us because you're funded, because there's an incentive being given to you by these foreign governments who want to see us fail. And they end up using that as well as a way of galvanizing the region. And we've seen this happen where, when we have been abused, when there have been clear human rights abuses in Zimbabwe by our government, and we have appealed to SADC, the Southern African Development Community, or the African Union, there has been no response. SADC and the African Union are notorious for being silent when citizens of African nations are being abused by their own governments. This is where they should come in to mediate, to reprimand one of their own. But they don't do that because the narrative they're being sold is that what is happening to us as a government, where we are being destabilized by Western governments, could happen to you. In fact, it's part of a larger plan to destabilize the whole region. And of course, that is not true.
It does seem like the African Union's slogan of silencing the guns of civil conflict across the continent doesn't really apply when it comes to guns that are being fired on peaceful protesters.
Correct. And I think this is what Africans and young Africans in particular are beginning to become restless about. The fact that you are not prepared to look at the injustices. You're not prepared to look at the injustices that are being perpetrated against us by our own governments and condemn them roundly and take a bold stance on them. And you'll continue to see this restlessness spread across Africa. But personally, I sense a wave of young Africans rising up saying this is not acceptable for our futures to be destroyed like this. It's not acceptable for us to be treated the way we are being treated, and that we demand better.
So where do you, coming from your long history being involved in activism and putting your own life and safety on the line, where do you see hope for Zimbabwe, given that it seems like Western pressure and sanctions have failed to enact a change? SADC and the AU are silent or not taking the measures required, and protests from within are ruthlessly suppressed. So where's their hope for change?
Elliot, the hope for change, more than anything else, actually lies at home. It actually lies within us. The evidence of what we did in 2016 when we stood up against Robert Mugabe, when nobody expected that there would be any meaningful opposition to Robert Mugabe, whom people had in our hearts. I think most Zimbabweans had decided that, look, he's going to die in power and that's just it. We're going to have to live with it. But we found it within ourselves to stand up to him in 2016 when we began the journey. My belief is that the help that we may call for from external actors, whether it is the international community or the United Nations or whatever it is that we may call with sanctions and so forth, that help is useless if the people themselves are not involved in starting their own journey of looking for change. And I think that journey in Zimbabwe, though slow, is very much underway. It's not going to happen in one instant. It's going to take a few years. The mobilization, the realizations are going to take a few years to happen. So there is hope, and that hope lies in people themselves becoming more conscientized, becoming more invested and reached to people are beginning to understand that their personal involvement as ordinary people is what forms the very seed of the politics of a nation. That it's not just about voting, that it's about learning to hold our elected officials to account throughout their term. It's about learning to keep track of the different development projects that are there and demanding accountability, that it is about demanding to be part of a corporate vision setting process rather than just sitting and being told that this is what the country shall become. So I think we've walked a journey now in Zimbabwe. It is my belief that we have a lot more people that are engaged in the political process in Zimbabwe than we ever had before. And I'm glad that we played a small role through our movement to awaken a generation of people, or at least to give some sense of boldness, to people to get involved. We had a phrase that we came up with during the time that became part of our rallying call, and it says, if we cannot cause the politician to change, then we must inspire the citizen to be bold. So it became a very important rallying call for us. If we cannot cause the politician to change, then we must inspire the citizen to be bold. And I think that's the journey that we are on right now.
So what's the next step in that journey? What's in the future for you, to the extent that you can share that with us without jeopardizing your safety or that of your family?
Well, I think one of the things that is on the horizon in Zimbabwe in 2023 are elections. And this is going to be another litmus test for the readiness of citizens in Zimbabwe, but also an opportunity for us to grow the citizen voices and citizen involvement, for Zimbabwe becoming a different country, at least maybe in the next two election cycles. So the first election that Mnangagwa had was clearly rigged. He had no support, and even the courts were captured in terms of how they dealt with the appeal against the results that were announced. So going forward, part of what we're doing right now in Zimbabwe is realizing that we have a new generation of people, of young people that have never voted, but that feel the effects of a nation that is not being run properly. Those people need to be caught early. Those people need to be educated early about the voting process, about being part of a political process. So I think a strategy that I can reveal to you right now is that there is a big push to register more and more young people to vote and be part of the election process. Our nation is about maybe 65, I would dare say maybe 75% young people. These are people under the age of 40. And that's a really powerful base. So that's one of the big strategies that is there, is to politically, conscientize these young people, get them into a place where they understand that there is a connection with the lack of unemployment, which in Zimbabwe has sat at about 90% unemployment rate. There is a connection between that employment rate and bad governance, to get them to understand the corruption. One of the effects of COVID, the coronavirus in Zimbabwe, is that corruption went through the roof. Government officials stole funds that had been set aside for coronavirus containment programs. And so a lot of young people are beginning to connect the dots. So the next phase, I think, for us is helping a generation to connect the dots so that it then translates to being a result at the ballot box. But also part of that is we're talking openly now about how do we defend the vote, because it's one thing to mobilize people to vote. It's another thing to defend the vote when the vote is being stolen. And there's a lot of projects and programs that are around that I cannot necessarily mention publicly at this point.
Just briefly before we wind up, what steps are you taking to safeguard your own health, your own well-being, and that of your family and colleagues, given the tremendous risk that you're all taking to undergo these efforts?
Elliot, it's always a difficult choice or a difficult balance. Maybe let me put it that way. It's always a difficult balance to try and have maximum impact and have maximum safety at the same time. One of the things we have learned on this journey is that as you step up, as you stand out, you're going to expose yourself more and more. And whilst you do have each of us, we do have basic measures in place to keep ourselves safe, to keep ourselves healthy, there are moments where there is very little you can do to be safe from the regime or to be safe from the effects of speaking truth to power. Sometimes once you are in prison, the number of times that I was arrested and in prison, I almost always came out either with a respiratory infection or a skin disease of some sort. Because that's just part of what happens when you are on this journey. But nevertheless, we do want to always make sure that we are alive to either tell the story or to inspire the next generation. One of my big messages to young people as we do what we do is, it's important that we stay alive so that we can celebrate the wins, so that we can inspire the next generation, because, what good is a dead hero? Having said that, we have lost some amazing people during the process who would have done us really, really proud had they been alive, today. So it's an ongoing dilemma to try and keep safe and to try and be effective at the same time. And we do our best to operate in both those modes.
Evan, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. Really appreciate it. And thank you also for all the work that you do and sharing your tremendously inspiring story today.
Thank you so much, Elliot. It is always a pleasure to speak on behalf of Zimbabwe. I am not the only voice. There are many voices in Zimbabwe that are doing an amazing job. But whenever we get the chance to add to amplifying what's happening in Zimbabwe, it's a humbling experience, and I want to thank you for that.
Evan Mawarire is a Zimbabwean pastor and pro-democracy activist. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trend Lines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman with 2 L's and 1 T, and Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.